Okay, here we go. As we come sort of to the end of our discussion of the Middle Ages, I wanted to make sure that I talked about one of the most famous documents that ever came out of the Middle Ages. It's one of my favorite things of all time. It's called the Magna Carta. Basically means the Great Charter, sort of in a Latin term if I'm not mistaken. But this has had a lot of influence, again, on modern times, especially the United States of America. So check this out. Watch how this works out. Here we go. The Magna Carta was signed, this is a document signed in 1215 between the King of England, okay? And the King of England at this time is King John. And King John is the younger brother of Richard the Lionhearted. Remember my discussion at the end of the Crusades? Richard the Lionhearted was the most famous king to go to the Crusades, okay? And so Richard is killed on the way back to England, and John takes over. And this is exactly, supposedly, when Robin Hood was alive, by the way. Okay, remember, Robin Hood was one of King Richard's crusaders. So Richard doesn't make it home. He's killed along the way home. Robin Hood does. So this is during this time. So it's signed between King John and his lords. And in England, one of the terms they use is for lords. Remember the feudal pyramid? Okay, the king, lords, vassals, serfs. So in England, they called them barons. Okay? What is the purpose of this? Now, this is why I find this interesting, and this is why this is unique, is that basically when we think of kings, we think of dictators, we think of tyrants, we think of guys with ultimate power, queens too, people with ultimate power. Well, the purpose of this document is to limit the power of the King of England. Certainly John, and then all the subsequent monarchs, okay? You know, there's an old, well, look, this is basically to say that law should apply to all citizens. You can't have different types of laws for the elitists of society and for the lower classes of society. Everybody's a citizen. This is the argument that the Magna Carta makes. So what we need is, we need laws that everybody has to abide by, including the king. What was the sort of trigger for this? Well, John argued that his brother, his older brother, Richard, had bankrupted England, and that England had no money. So John, who was a younger guy, John was charging incredibly high amounts of taxation on the people. Okay, like there's a story that he made a rule that suddenly one day all wild animals in the British Islands were property of the king. So if you hunted and killed a wild animal for dinner, you owed a tax to the king. And so these arbitrary, crazy, outrageous taxes suddenly were placed upon all these people. And again, John's argument is that England was broke because of his brother's crusade. Okay? The barons revolted against John. Okay? And they do something called a march on London, and they capture him. Now, this is not a bloody march. This is not a civil war. Okay? This was a symbolic march. So you got to understand what I'm saying here is that this is a little bit different. This is landowners basically, quote unquote, revolting against the king. This is not normal. This is not the way things usually worked. Okay? Usually the landowners supported the king. And let me just say that this is like, you know, there's a lot of barons in England, and it was probably split half and half. A lot of barons supported John, but there were many barons who were going to support the Magna Carta and this march on London. And they get there when it's a symbolic march. And one of the interesting stories is that when the barons arrived at the gates of London, the gates had been left open by the citizens of the city, implying that the citizens of the city of London were on the side of the barons who were in favor of the Magna Carta. They quote unquote capture him. They don't put him in chains. They don't put him in irons or anything like that. John basically agrees to come and meet with them. They set up a big tent in the city, okay? And basically John is going to sign this document. And one of the main things that I think you should remember is this word arbitrary. John had to accept that his rule wasn't arbitrary, meaning he couldn't just have someone punished because he said so. Now there's an old joke that kings used to say, if a king said, "Off with your head," well, guess what happened by that afternoon? You had your head chopped off. That's arbitrary. It's like being whimsical, if you will. How's that sound? Kings throughout history, kings and pharaohs and emperors could do things whimsically. They could do things just because they wanted to. And this basically, the Magna Carta tried to stop that he couldn't be arbitrary. There had to be a process of law. There had to be rule of law had to be done. So punishment only occurred after the process of law was completed. There had to be, as you can see, this is the discussion of due process, which I'll come back to. One part of the Magna Carta said that a committee of 25 barons could be set up at any time to overrule the actions of the king if it's so deemed so necessary. This is a very interesting part of this whole thing because this brings about the whole concept of separation of powers, because this leads to the beginnings of what we would today call in America separation of powers. The president, the Congress, and the judiciary, three branches of Congress. In England, it's the same thing. So they have, today they have a prime minister, but so before they had a prime minister, for example, you'd have a monarch, you would have a parliament, and then you would have the judiciary, which is making sure the process of law is completed. So these are the types of things that, again, this is my argument about here's an ancient document that's over 800 years old that still is very influential upon us today to separate the powers. There you go, to separate the powers of government. Now, you may wonder what kind of king would agree to this, and you are correct. John signed it, okay? But he had no intention of abiding by it. And he almost immediately began going against it, okay? He claimed he was forced to sign it under threat. There's not much evidence of that. There is no significant evidence that John was put into prison or put into a jail cell or anything like that, or was threatened, that he signed it of his own accord. Okay? The Pope sided with John. That's one of the unique things about this whole thing. The Pope was on John's side. The Pope was on, at this time England is still a Roman Catholic country, and so the Pope defended all the kings and monarchs that were Roman Catholic. And look, this is going to cause a civil war. This is going to cause some bloodshed in England for sure. There's a story that goes that as soon as the ceremony actually happened where John signs it, and there's a story that goes that all of the barons that were there present, they had planned this out. They promised, they did this ceremonial thing where they all took a knee and they re-swore allegiance to their king, basically saying, even though you've signed this and given away some of your power, we still recognize you as our king. And they tried to do that to have an impression on King John. Apparently it didn't have that much of an impression on him because obviously he rejects it. And other English monarchs are going to reject it along the way. And look, both male and female, a parliament is going to sort of become more permanent, okay? And the worst guy of all who ignored the Magna Carta was probably the most famous king of all, and we're going to get into him hopefully in May when we all come back, and his name was Henry VIII. And Henry VIII is one of the very fascinating and interesting people of world history. Okay, so what's the importance of the Magna Carta? Well, I think you can sort of tell already. Unfortunately, we haven't done political spectrum number 2 in this class. And political spectrum number 2 is one of the things that I make a big deal out of. There's a particular type of government system that's called a republic, and a republic is basically a rule of law society, as opposed to rule by one or rule by a dictator or rule by few. That term is oligarchs. So this is an attempt to change. If you think about history, ancient history is dominated by dictators and tyrants and those types of things. Modern history still has plenty of dictators and tyrants, don't get me wrong, but you have a lot of democratic societies. You have a lot of democratic republic societies. And this is when does this move happen? Well, I would argue that this move has happened because of this famous document called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, I mentioned this a moment ago, the idea of due process. And this is this whole idea that an accused person must be given the opportunity to defend themselves, and the concept of trial by jury. And of course, you've watched plenty of TV shows and movies, cop movies, where the policeman arrests some guy, and what do they? This is the easiest way for me to put this. The cop reads the person they've captured their Miranda rights, and those are things like you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney will be the state will pay for an attorney for you, etc., etc. Those, you have a right to a jury trial by jury of your peers, etc. Those are all things that are what we call due process. Okay. Now, this concept of due process has its roots in this English document called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was very popular with the founding fathers of the United States. They loved the thing, especially the group that wrote the U.S. Constitution. I think there was only 11 founding fathers that signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. But the Magna Carta is super influential on the writers of the U.S. Constitution, especially those who were in favor of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, of course, is the one that protects. We briefly spoke about the Constitution, about how the Constitution has two parts. It says what government can do, and then the one part says what government can do, and then the other part says what are the rights that every citizen should have. So the Bill of Rights is particularly popular. And a criticism of the Magna Carta is that there's no mention of serfs. Okay? There is no mention of serfs. Serfs were not protected by the Magna Carta. And this is something that many people they'll say, well, this thing is no good. This thing is useless. There's no reason that this thing should be admired because the lowest of the low are not protected. And then, look, that's a valid argument. But there are certain times where once things get rolling, it's hard to stop them. And so once certain groups of people get rights, other people are going to say that as well. And there are going to be people that are going to advocate for these people that are at the low end of the social spectrum to get protected under the law. Okay? And look, it's not a perfect system, but this type of stuff is very critical. And I think, again, hopefully you can see the influence of this document on modern times. So I just want to show you this one picture right here. This is a panel on the door. Okay, this is a panel on the door at the United States Supreme Court building, and it's a big. There's these two big gold doors, and each panel is a representation of some famous moment in the history of law. And so this is supposedly the moment in which King John, who's on the right, he basically signs this document. You can see that he's putting his stamp on it. You can see the document here. He's putting his stamp on it. Okay, so he is agreeing. This is a representative of a baron, and you can see that the baron has his sword drawn. However, it is not in a fashion that is threatening. So this is on the front door, literally, to walk into the Supreme Court chamber, not the front door of the Supreme Court building, to walk into the chamber where it actually goes down, where the 9 justices meet. This is one of the panels on the door of that particular place. And it's pretty cool. I've seen it. It's actually pretty cool. Okay? All right, there you go. I love the Magna Carta. I think the Magna Carta is one of the cool things of history. I hope you like that discussion and like that story as well. Okay, everybody? Hopefully we're getting close to coming back. We'll see what happens. Miss you all. Hope you're all doing well out there. See you next time. Aloha.